One Sunday morning, Linda found 2 coffee cups on the counter, 2 spoons, the sugar bowl left open, the way it used to be, back when there were 2 people using it. Her father had lived alone for 11 years, and the person he seemed to be expecting for coffee had been dead for just as long. That's not actually what this video is about, though it's where the story starts. This is about 5 changes that showed up in her father over 5 months, changes families see constantly and almost always explain away as just getting older. Less activity, more daytime sleep, less appetite, not fully bouncing back after being sick, and needing help with things he used to do alone. None of these by itself tells you much, and some of them have completely treatable causes: a medication, an untreated infection, a mood change, dehydration. What tends to matter is whether several of them show up together, stick around longer than a bad week, and move in the same direction instead of reversing on their own. There's a concept underneath all of it worth naming now because it'll come back. Baseline. Not is this normal for someone 84. Normal for an 84-year-old who still walks 2 miles a day looks nothing like normal for an 84-year-old who already uses a walker. The only baseline that actually matters is the person's own who they were 6 months ago, compared with who they are now. That's the lens this whole story runs through, even in the moments that don't look medical at all. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. Her father had walked 2 miles every morning for 30 years. Rain, snow, it never mattered. That Tuesday, he stayed in his chair by the window instead. "You feeling okay, Dad?" "Just tired," he said. She let it go. He was 84. People get tired. That same evening, he beat her at a crossword clue she'd been stuck on for 10 minutes, sharp as always, which is exactly why nothing about that day felt like the start of anything. His appointment that week came back fine. Blood pressure normal. Nothing a doctor flagged. A single appointment is a snapshot. It tells you whether today's numbers are in range. It doesn't tell you whether this week looks different from last year. That's a different question. And usually only the family is positioned to notice it, because a doctor who sees someone for 15 minutes twice a year has no way to see the slope of the line, only one point on it. Her brother, 4 states away, got the update in a 2-minute phone call that same week. He's fine, just slowing down a bit. Linda meant it when she said it. She just hadn't lined the days up next to each other yet, the way you can't when you're the one seeing someone every single day. That was the first change. Ordinary lasted about 6 weeks after it. Then he started sleeping through most of the afternoon. Not a nap most of the day. He'd wake for lunch, eat a little, and be back asleep within the hour. The football games he used to watch, start to finish, now lost him by halftime. Her son, Sam, 8 years old, had a standing Saturday ritual with his grandfather checkers on the back porch. Best of 3, always let to win just often enough to keep it interesting. Grandpa fell asleep during checkers again, Sam told her one Saturday. I moved his piece for him. He said it like it was nothing. It wasn't a straight decline, though. Some Saturdays her father was completely himself, cracking jokes, arguing with the television. Those afternoons made it easy to believe nothing had really changed. That inconsistency is actually normal, and worth expecting. Gradual decline rarely moves in a straight line, which is exactly why it's so easy for families to talk themselves out of what they're seeing on the bad days. Sleeping more than usual can come from a dozen places: medication, mood, poor nighttime sleep, a brewing illness, and on its own it rarely tells you which one. It just tells you something is using up energy he used to have. That was the second change. By the 3rd month, his appetite had gone too. He'd always been a big eater, the kind of man who went back for seconds without being asked. Now he'd take a few bites of his favorite meal and push it away. "Just not hungry," he'd say. Flat, automatic. Linda tried the obvious things: smaller portions, his favorite dishes, dessert moved to the front of the meal. None of it changed much, and it scared her more than the sleeping had, because in her family, food had always been how you showed someone you loved them. Eventually, she stopped pushing. She just sat with him while he ate what he wanted, however little that was, the two of them talking about nothing while most of the plate went cold. It's worth knowing why appetite loss gets flagged at all. It's not really about any single skipped meal, it's what it adds up to over weeks. Less muscle, less energy reserve, less to draw on if the body has to fight something off. That was the third change. Around that same time, her father started talking about her mother, who had passed away 11 years earlier. He'd mentioned that she'd stopped by that morning, that he needed his coat because she was waiting outside. This part isn't one of the 5 changes, and it's worth being clear about that. It isn't a medical sign of anything in particular. It can come from grief, from medication, from an illness affecting memory, or simply from how some people experience this stage of life, and researchers don't fully agree on why it happens as often as it does. Linda never found a clean explanation for it, and she stopped needing one. He wasn't confused about anything else. He knew exactly who Linda was, and asked about Sam's Little League team that same afternoon. He talked about her mother the way you'd talk about someone who'd simply left the room. What mattered to Linda wasn't why it was happening. It was that he wasn't frightened by it. So instead of correcting him, she started listening. That was the Sunday of the 2 cups. The sugar bowl left open, the same way her mother used to leave it. Years ago, back when leaving it open meant she'd be right back to close it. Linda stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, then washed both cups without saying a word. The next time it happened, she didn't correct him. She just asked, "Tell me about her." He told her about a drive to the coast in 1974, a car that overheated twice, arriving 4 hours late to a wedding they weren't sure they'd make. He laughed, telling it really laughed, the kind she hadn't heard from him in months. 6 more weeks passed. Then an ordinary chest cold turned into pneumonia. It started small, a cough he waved off for 3 days, until Linda found him shivering under a blanket in a room that wasn't cold. His oxygen was low enough that urgent care sent him straight to the ER. There'd been a urinary infection earlier that year, gone within days, and he'd bounced back like nothing happened. This time was different from the start. The stay stretched to nearly 3 weeks instead of 1. Her brother flew in the next day, and the difference in their father stopped him at the door for a second before he walked in thinner, slower, smaller in the hospital bed than the man he'd pictured on the phone a few days earlier. Getting sick isn't really the concerning part at this stage of life. It's what happens after. The real question isn't, did he get sick? It's, did he return to where he was before? Every illness draws down some amount of physical reserve, the strength and stamina held in reserve for exactly this kind of event, and a younger body typically rebuilds that reserve on its own. As reserve narrows with age, the same illness can draw it down further than it used to, and rebuilding it can take longer or stop short of where it started. This time he didn't return fully. He was quieter in the days after, slower to laugh at things that would normally have gotten one out of him. That was the 4th change. He came home needing a walker where he'd never needed one before. The first time he used it, in the hospital hallway, he made a joke about finally getting his own set of wheels, and Linda laughed harder than the joke deserved. Getting up from his chair, something he'd done 10,000 times without thinking, now took real effort and usually a hand from Linda. Watch what happens to ordinary tasks. That's the practical version of this. Getting out of a chair, walking to the mailbox, showering, dressing, cooking a meal, keeping track of their own medication. When something that used to happen automatically suddenly needs another person's help, that's not something to file under getting older. On its own, aging slows people down somewhat, but it doesn't typically hand someone a new dependency overnight. A sudden or accumulating need for help is usually a sign that something underneath has shifted, even if nobody can name what yet. It's worth a specific conversation with a doctor. That was the 5th change. Her brother asked her, in that hospital hallway, if their father was going to be okay. Yes, she said. 2 months earlier, she'd have been completely right. This time, something in her wasn't as sure, and she couldn't have told you why. That uncertainty was worth trusting. She asked the doctor something more specific than "is he okay?" whether this recovery looked as complete as the last one. He didn't dodge it. Recovery at this stage often isn't a straight line back to where someone started, he said. Then he gave her the sentence that reorganized everything she'd been carrying alone for 5 months. Stop asking whether each individual thing is normal for his age. Start asking what's changing together and in which direction. That question gave Linda a much more useful way to organize what she'd been seeing. For clinicians, a person's usual baseline, how long a change has lasted, and whether they recover after illness can all matter more than any single symptom on its own, which is part of why a family's account of the last few months is often more useful in that room than a single set of vitals taken that day. You can turn that into 4 questions, and they work for almost anyone you're quietly keeping an eye on. Is this different from how they usually are? Has it lasted, rather than come and gone in a day? If they got sick or hurt, did they come all the way back afterward? And is more than one of these moving at the same time? A specific timeline is more useful to a doctor than a general worry. He seems a little off lately. Is easy to wave away in a 15-minute appointment. He's slept most of every afternoon for 6 weeks and hasn't finished a plate in a month is much harder to. That's the difference between a family being politely reassured and a family actually being heard. If it helps to have it as a short list, these are the 5 worth actually watching. Movement, are they walking less or needing help getting up that they didn't a few months ago? Sleep and energy, are they sleeping noticeably more during the day than their own normal pattern, not just more than you'd like? Appetite, are they eating consistently less or losing weight without trying to? Recovery after an illness or a fall, do they come back to where they were or land somewhere a little lower? And daily function, are ordinary tasks that used to happen without a second thought suddenly requiring someone else's help? None of them predicts how much time someone has. What they tell you is that something has changed enough to deserve a closer look. One more distinction, because it matters. Everything here is about gradual change, the kind that gets explained away one Tuesday at a time, because each explanation on its own is reasonable. Sudden confusion, trouble breathing, chest pain, fainting, or sudden weakness on one side is a different category entirely. That's not something to track for a few months and bring up later. If it happens today, it needs attention today, not a note added to the list you're keeping for the next appointment. 2 weeks after the hospital, helping her father into the car, Linda felt his hands. Cold enough that it didn't match the morning. She held on a second longer than she meant to. Then, helping with his shoes, she saw something else. A faint bluish, mottled pattern along his feet that hadn't been there before. Cold or mottled hands and feet can happen for plenty of reasons on their own: circulation, temperature, medication, low blood pressure, an illness the body is already fighting, and they aren't one of the 5 changes either. What they did for Linda wasn't diagnose anything. They simply arrived alongside everything else. She'd already been watching: the chair by the window, the plate he stopped finishing, the hospital he didn't fully recover from, the walker by the door and standing in the driveway with his shoe still in her hand. That was enough for her to finally stop looking at each one separately. 5 changes, 5 months, not 5 isolated moments. One direction, the kind that's nearly impossible to see from inside any single week, and much harder to miss once you finally lay the months out end to end. Her father passed away on a Thursday morning in early spring, at home, with Linda beside him. Her brother had flown back the week before. Palliative care had gotten involved in his final weeks, not to end treatment, but to keep him comfortable, and it gave the family room to just be with him instead of managing him. She was holding her father's hand. It was warm. She thought about all the mornings, decades earlier, when she'd pressed her own cold hands against his arm just to steal his warmth, how he used to complain about it, laughing, calling her a menace before wrapping his arm around her anyway. For a few final hours, the hand she remembered as warm felt warm again. She never got a clean explanation for every change she'd seen over those 5 months. She stopped needing one. What she needed instead was to stop waiting for certainty before paying attention, to ask about 1974 instead of correcting him, to sit with the plate instead of pushing it, to set out a second coffee cup instead of an argument. She still has the crossword page from the hospital, pen mark trailing off mid-clue, tucked in a drawer she opens more often than she'd expect to. If someone in your life is changing slowly in ways you can't quite explain, don't try to diagnose it yourself from a video. Start writing the changes down a plain running list. Dated is enough. Compare them to that person's own baseline, not a general idea of normal for their age. And bring the timeline, not just the worry, to their doctor. A written pattern is something a clinician can actually use in a 15-minute visit. A feeling of unease usually isn't through no fault of anyone in the room. If there's someone in your family you've been quietly watching change, send them this. Not because it tells you what's happening, it doesn't. But it might help them notice the pattern and ask a better question. And tell me in the comments, what was the first change you noticed? Before you go, if this kind of story helps you see your own family a little more clearly, that's exactly what this channel is for. Every week, Prime Health Insights breaks down the quiet changes in aging that are easy to miss and hard to talk about, so you're not figuring it out alone in a hospital hallway at 11 at night, the way Linda was. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you before you need it, not after.